Hi everyone, my name's Wendy. Welcome to my channel Show Me Mo Vegan, where I make easy whole food vegan meals. Today, I'm talking about how to build a balanced whole food vegan diet. I'll cover my method as well as some other popular methods and resources. But first, let's start with a few definitions. Often, people lump vegan and whole food plant-based together. While they are related, there are some key differences. Becoming vegan is an ethical choice. It's a lifestyle rather than a diet, so it eliminates animal products with regard to both food and other items such as shoes, clothing, furniture, and beauty products. As you can see from the official definition, being vegan doesn't mean completely eliminating exploitation and cruelty, because we all know perfection is not possible. Instead, it seeks to avoid these things as much as is possible and practicable. There's also a secondary environmental component. A common misconception is that being vegan means you're healthier. While it's true there seems to be some correlation between vegans and having fewer chronic diseases than the general population, that's not necessarily the rule. It is possible, especially these days, to be vegan and eat only highly processed junk food. On the other hand, you have a whole food plant-based diet, which is primarily a health choice. This means prioritizing whole, unprocessed plant foods as well as mushrooms, which I thought I'd mention because a lot of people like to point out that mushrooms aren't plants. So maybe you'd like it better if we called it a whole food plant and fungus-based diet, but that doesn't exactly have the same ring to it. And are we really arguing about semantics here? If that's your argument, I'm guessing you're just grasping at anything to distract from the real issue. But I digress. Back to the comparison. While most doctors and researchers in the plant-based space tend to agree that a diet completely free of animal products is likely optimal, whole food plant-based does not necessarily eliminate all animal products. Therefore, it's possible to be vegan and whole food plant-based, but all those on a plant-based diet are not necessarily vegan. I fall here in this overlapping point. I am vegan for ethical reasons, therefore I do not consume animal products, but I also aim for a mostly whole food diet for health reasons. A little about my story. Before I went vegan, I suffered with ulcerative colitis symptoms for about 3 years. After some bad side effects from the drugs that I was given, I decided to look for a more natural alternative. So I had already started eliminating some processed foods, and while that helped a little bit, it didn't solve the problem. It was actually when I was starting to give up on the idea of a natural remedy when I saw some videos on YouTube that inspired me to go vegan for ethical reasons. And to my surprise, within a few weeks, my UC symptoms completely disappeared. So I dug into the research and I found out that I really was onto something. Nearly a year later after becoming vegan, I'm still symptom-free. Now, I'm not saying it's a cure-all, but a whole food vegan diet is your best bet for allowing your body to heal and avoid chronic disease. Through this diet, I've also gotten my high cholesterol back to a normal level, and I've improved my adult acne. So what exactly do I eat? Generally, about 85 to 90% of my diet is whole, unprocessed foods. This means whole grains, beans, fruits, vegetables, and small amounts of nuts and seeds. The other 10 to 15% includes minimally processed foods like whole grain pastas and breads, tofu, and tempeh. I avoid highly processed foods like oil and processed junk foods. Note the difference between minimally processed and ultra-processed or refined foods. The former, while still processed, is made up of the whole plant. The latter is an unnatural creation that adds or removes something from the whole plant in a way that nature never intended. So, for example, the whole wheat pasta that I mentioned includes all parts of the whole grain, whereas something like oil is highly refined. Oil is just the extracted fat from the plant where all the fiber, protein, carbs, and most of the nutrients have been stripped away. Plant-based and vegan eating doesn't have to be complicated, but it might take a little bit of practice. We all grew up eating a certain way. This was influenced by family, friends, governmental guidelines, society, and more. So when you've been eating one way your entire life, of course it's difficult to think of change. It can be overwhelming to even consider it. Hopefully this method will make it a little easier. It's really quite simple. Instead of trying to plan out my whole diet, I like to take it one meal at a time and think in terms of my plate. For each meal, I try to make sure I'm including foods from the following 4 groups: beans or legumes, whole grains, vegetables, and fruit. The exact amounts of each food will depend on your individual activity level and goals. For me personally, this looks like about half a plate of beans and whole grains and a half a plate of vegetables and fruit. Usually I include a starchy vegetable like potatoes, sweet potatoes, or squash, some non-starchy vegetables like leafy greens, peppers, or broccoli, and a bit of fruit. I usually also garnish with just a little bit of nuts or seeds. Now, I already hear you saying, but aren't you worried about protein or calcium? I hear vegans don't get enough iron. Let me stop you right there. If you're eating the foods you were designed by nature to eat, you don't really need to worry too terribly much about getting particular nutrients. I mean, think about it. Look to your own backyard. Have you ever seen a squirrel looking for a nutrition label before it cracked open a nut? Or maybe go further into nature. Ever heard of a gazelle checking to see how much calcium or protein is in the grass it's grazing? Or a lion trying to figure out which prey has the optimal macro composition? No, because they don't have to. They're in their natural environment, eating the foods they were designed to eat. We only started having trouble when we took ourselves out of our natural environment and started eating unnatural, processed foods. So, unless you're actively working to correct an identified deficiency with a medical professional, you probably don't need to worry about specific nutrients as long as you're eating an abundance of whole plant foods in the 4 categories I've described. If you're coming from a standard American diet full of extra fat and sugar, your body's natural satiety mechanisms may be a little hijacked, but once you switch over to whole plant foods and start to get used to it, your body will adjust. Now that I've adjusted, I don't worry too terribly much about how much I need to eat. Instead, I listen to my body's hunger signals and eat more or less depending on how I feel. When we eat primarily whole plant foods, our bodies intuitively know how much to eat. But do note, often when switching to a whole food vegan diet, many people tend not to eat enough. This is because animal products and processed foods are much more calorie dense than whole plant foods due to a higher fat content and very little or no fiber. Fat is essentially twice as caloric as carbs or protein. A gram of fat is 9 calories, while a gram of carbohydrate or protein is about 4 calories. Therefore, when you cut out all the animal fat, you're automatically and drastically cutting calories. There are tons of great resources out there about calorie density if you want to dive deeper into this topic. We are so conditioned to portion control. So when switching, people tend to eat the same limited amount of food. But because of the lower calorie density of plants, you really can eat much more volume and your stomach literally fills up before you could possibly eat the same number of calories that you're used to. This sends signals to your brain when it's time to stop eating, and that's why you generally don't have to worry about overeating if you're consuming whole plant foods. Don't be concerned if at first you feel a little less energetic and a little more hungry. It does take some time to get used to and figure it all out. But once you find the right balance of foods for your body, you'll feel more satisfied and more energetic than ever. Remember, nobody's perfect and you don't have to be. The great thing about our food choices is one bad choice won't ruin your whole life. Work for an overall healthy eating pattern and you'll be doing just fine. If you're still concerned about specific nutrients, there are some great resources to help you check on this. Now, I don't recommend tracking food, but it might give you some peace of mind just to check it out for a few days and see where you're at. I've used Cronometer before, which has a free version with a massive database of foods to choose from. You simply add what foods you've eaten and what quantity of those foods, and then you can see a breakdown of all the macro and micronutrients you're getting. This can be helpful as a snapshot, but take it with a grain of salt, as recommended daily amounts are debatable. So don't be too concerned if you don't hit 100% on everything. There is one specific nutrient that I want to bring attention to, and that's B12. Be sure you're including a B12 supplement. Now, B12 isn't created by plants or animals, but rather bacteria. It's thought that we used to get adequate amounts of B12 from the water we were drinking and the microbes on the dirt of the plants that we were foraging. But of course, we chlorinate our water now and wash our produce. So it's important to supplement. And if this seems unnatural to you, just keep in mind that whether you're eating plants or animals, your B12 is likely coming from a supplement. Most conventionally raised animals are supplemented with B12, and that's how it winds up in the meat. So now that you know what categories of foods to eat and that you don't need to be too concerned about specific nutrients, well, how do you actually do it? I'm not a gourmet chef. I wouldn't even call myself a great home cook. I like cooking, but I hate complicated recipes. If it involves much more than chopping, cooking, and eating, I'm probably not doing it. The point of me saying this is it doesn't have to be complicated and anyone can do this. There's a connotation that being whole food vegan is difficult because there's so much cooking and prep to learn how to do, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Now, if you've never cooked anything, there would be a little bit of a learning curve. But cooking vegan food is no more challenging than cooking animal-based foods. In fact, I would argue just the opposite. You don't have to worry about cross-contamination or making sure your food is cooked to the right temperature. You just cook it and eat it. Plus, whole vegan foods are some of the easiest foods to batch cook, which dramatically cuts down on your prep time. And cleanup is so much easier. I never realized how difficult cleaning dishes was until it suddenly became effortless on an oil-free vegan diet. I just thought tons of scrubbing was normal. But it turns out when you don't cook with animal fat or oil, everything just rinses clean. Sometimes you might need an occasional soak, but honestly, I don't know why I even use soap anymore because it just rinses off. Now, I've covered how I like to think about my meal planning, but if that's not resonating or you still just need a little extra help, there are tons of resources out there. I love Dr. Greger's Daily Dozen, and if you're a checklist type of person, you will too. You can simply print off the checklist or use the app, which includes a list of foods to try to fit into your day. Now, don't dwell on getting every single one every single day. The point is, if you fit all these in, you will certainly crowd out the less healthy foods from your plate. The Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine is another great science-based resource. PCRM has their Power Plate, which is similar to my plating technique. Try their 21-day vegan kickstart plan. It includes tons of recipes and ideas for helping switch to plant-based eating. And 21 days is a perfect amount to start building the habit of healthy eating. Dr. McDougall's starch solution is also very similar. He emphasizes filling your plate with starches, potatoes, grains, and beans, and then add fruits and non-starchy vegetables to that. So same basic principle, just explained a little differently. Check it out and see if it resonates with you. I also like Dr. Bolsewitz's advice of including as much diversity as possible on your plate. Dr. B has a wonderful book called Fiber Fueled, which explains why the more varieties of plants you eat, the better. He recommends shooting for at least 30 different types of plants every week. One word of caution. While it's great to have your favorite plant-based doctor, it's easy to get caught up in the weeds of what each one focuses on. While there are minor differences between the doctors, such as whether or not to include added salt and sugar, the overall message is the same and is supported by overwhelming research. And that message is to prioritize whole plant foods. Do that and you're way ahead of the standard American diet. Finally, a note on organic versus conventional. I try to buy organic as much as is possible, but of course organic can be expensive. So if it's not available or it's outside of your budget, don't worry about it. It is much more important to focus on whole plant foods than it is to get organic. You can periodically check the Dirty Dozen list put out each year by the Environmental Working Group. These are foods that it is best to always choose organic, as they tend to have higher levels of pesticide residue. Also check the Clean 15 list of foods that are generally safer to buy conventional. There are certain foods that I always buy organic. Oats are an example of a crop that is sprayed with Roundup to dry it out and make it easier to harvest. Glyphosate, the main ingredient of Roundup, which is technically an antibiotic, is linked to a whole host of health problems. So since I'm eating oats every day, I always buy those organic. Now, it is true that organic foods may contain traces of these pesticides and other chemicals, because often the organic fields are right next to the conventional fields and, wind. So while it's impossible to be completely chemical-free, choosing organic is your best bet for reducing exposure. Again, if it's not within your budget, don't worry. Prioritize any fruits, veggies, whole grains, and beans, whether organic or conventional, and realize that those choices have a profound impact on reducing your risk for chronic diseases as well as lowering your carbon footprint. There are so many tools out there to help you switch. These are just a few of my favorites. Let me know in the comments if you try out any of these ideas and how it goes. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel so you can get more tips on following a whole food vegan lifestyle. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.